Pope Francis has died. But there's something no one expects to discover. What really happened on the morning of April 21st? Why is his passing not the end, but the beginning of a much greater divine plan that's yet to unfold? A secret letter, an unfulfilled prophecy, and a message that will change the church forever. God never makes mistakes. Everything happens for a reason, and Pope Francis didn't leave by accident. The world was not mourning a politician or a celebrity. The world was mourning a servant, a witness, a soul whose flame had lit thousands of others, many of whom didn't even know they were cold until they felt the warmth. And as hearts around the globe broke open, heaven whispered something few dared to admit aloud: I do not make mistakes. God was not caught off guard. This wasn't a divine oversight. This wasn't a tragedy that slipped through the cracks of providence. This was part of the plan. Francis had always said it. In God's logic, the last will be first. The lost will be found. And even death will become a doorway. Now, standing at that doorway, the church began to feel both smaller and deeper. Smaller because its loudest voice had fallen silent. Deeper because its roots had just been watered by the tears of heaven. Heaven does not weep often, but on that morning, it did. Not because it lost a pope, but because it gained a servant home. And in the mystery of God's perfect plan, that moment of loss became a seed, planted not in the soil of sorrow, but in the soil of revival. What happens next? No one knows fully. But what is certain is this: God never gets it wrong. And everything, yes, everything, happens for a reason. Shall I continue with part 2 in this same tone, depth, and spiritual warmth? Part 2. Why now? When God's timing feels too painful to understand. The question echoed like a bell across every corner of the world. Why now? Why would God take him now? At this moment when the world seems so broken, when the church still carries so many wounds, when his presence seemed more needed than ever? Why would the shepherd be called home before the flock was ready? Why would the voice of mercy go silent in a world gasping for compassion? There were no quick answers. But in the spaces between the tears, faith began to speak. Pope Francis had long lived with the awareness that life is not measured by our timing, but by God's. He often reminded the world, God writes straight with crooked lines. His time is not our time, and his ways are not our ways. And now, in the silence left by his passing, those words no longer sounded poetic. They sounded prophetic. For those who knew him closely, the signs were already there. In his final months, Francis seemed to slow down, not just physically, but spiritually. His homilies became softer, his gestures more contemplative, his eyes, often full of mischief and light, grew deeper, almost as if they were already seeing something the rest of us could not. He spoke more often of surrender, of the cross, of endings. And during one of his final addresses, one barely reported by the media, he said something that now haunts and heals all at once. If the Lord calls me soon, do not say that he came too early. Say instead, he called him at the exact hour when the seed was ready. Those words were not meant for headlines. They were meant for hearts. Because this death was not random. It was not unjust. It was not the loss of control. It was the manifestation of holy timing. We live in a world obsessed with control, where timing is dictated by data, by demand, by desire. But the kingdom of God runs on trust, on surrender, on divine wisdom that often breaks us before it heals us. And what is more breaking than the death of a man who embodied hope? What is more painful than the loss of a father who taught us how to believe again? The truth is this: God knows the pain of loss. He watched his own son die. He stood silent as the earth went dark at Calvary. He let heaven seem empty for 3 days, so we would know that he does not rush resurrection. If Jesus had not been taken, the tomb would never have been opened. And if Francis had not departed, perhaps the church would not be shaken enough to awaken. Because sometimes God removes the light, not to leave us in darkness, but to teach us to become flame. Francis's death is not the end of his influence. It's the multiplication of it. Just as Jesus told his disciples, "It is better for you that I go, so that the Spirit may come." Now, Francis goes, so that the Spirit he carried may awaken in us. But it hurts. Oh, how it hurts. Who will be the next to take the throne? Part 1. The shepherd has departed. But heaven makes no mistakes. The morning of April 21st, 2025, began in silence. It wasn't the ordinary kind of silence, the kind that greets the waking hours or fills the quiet before dawn. No, this silence had weight. It was sacred. It was still. It was the kind of silence that heaven wraps around a holy moment, the kind that precedes divine unveiling. At exactly 4:58 a.m., people mourn him not like a leader, but like a father, like a friend, like a presence that made their faith feel like home again. A woman in Manila lit a candle outside her parish and whispered through tears. He was the only one who looked at us with eyes that didn't judge. In a prison chapel in Brazil, inmates who had never wept openly. He understood our chains, one said. He talked about mercy like someone who had tasted it. And in countless small corners of the world, there were people who had never met him, who didn't even speak his language, but who somehow knew that they had lost someone who saw them. That is why the timing feels cruel. Because love never feels convenient to lose. But faith says this: love never dies. And those who live in Christ, those who pour themselves out, empty for the sake of others, do not leave a void. They leave a calling. Francis is gone, but the hour of his departure is not a pause in the mission. It is a torch passed in silence. Not to cardinals in conclave, not to bishops in palaces, but to the people of God who remember what he taught without needing to quote it. To the grandmother who prays each night in the quiet. To the homeless man who felt dignity in a pope's gaze. To the child who saw in him a priest who smiled. To the priest who no longer felt alone in preaching tenderness. To the skeptic who said, "If God is like that man, maybe I'll listen again." His death hurts because it speaks. It speaks of the cost of love. It speaks of the risk of mercy. It speaks of a God who gives us exactly what we need, even when it looks like a loss. Francis lived with open hands, and now his empty chair is God's open question to us. Will you trust me, even when it breaks your heart? Because this much is true: God's timing is never late. It's never easy, but it is always perfect. Part 3. The Echo of Mercy. What Pope Francis truly left behind. When a leader dies, we count their accomplishments. When a saint dies, we count the lives they changed. But when a soul like Pope Francis dies, we don't count anything. We feel everything. And what the world feels now, in the space he once filled, is not just absence. It's echo, a holy echo. Because Francis did not lead with ideas, He led with mercy. Not the kind that can be measured or mapped, but the kind that gets into your bones. The kind that walks into the room and reminds you that you still belong. His legacy isn't carved into monuments or canon laws. It's carved into stories, thousands of them. Moments where heaven slipped into someone's life. Through him. There was the teenage girl in Bolivia who had been told the church had no place for her, until she saw the Pope kiss the hand of an indigenous grandmother with bare feet and say, "You carry more of the gospel than all of us." There was the prisoner in the Philippines who had never confessed, until he saw a photo of the Pope washing the feet of inmates, and felt that maybe mercy could find him too. There was the family in Syria who lost everything to war, but the mother kept a clipping of a sermon by Pope Francis in her pocket, because he once said, "God never looks away from those who suffer." These stories never made headlines, but they became the headlines of the heart. Because what Francis left behind is not a structure. He left a spirit that dares to believe that love is stronger than shame, that compassion is more powerful than rules, that the church can still be a home, even for those who no longer knock. His critics wanted definition. He gave them presence. His enemies wanted clarification. He gave them humility. His followers wanted direction. He gave them Christ. Not in thunder, but in tears. Not from balconies, but from sidewalks. Not in perfect words, but in wounded hands. And that's why his death has created not a void, but a voice. A voice rising up in the most unexpected places. In a dusty village in Kenya, a group of young people gathered to repaint their church, not because someone told them to, but because Pope Francis made us feel like we mattered. In an addiction recovery center in Mexico, a man who hadn't stepped into a chapel in 20 years sat alone before the Eucharist and whispered, "If he could believe in me, maybe God does too." And in a refugee camp in Lebanon, a child wrote on a scrap of cardboard, "Thank you, Papa Francisco. You saw us." This is the mercy that outlives a man. This is the mercy that becomes legacy. Pope Francis breathed his last breath in the quiet of his private chapel at Casa Santa Marta. There were no cameras, no final sermon, no rehearsed farewell. Just the humble rhythm of prayer, the low flicker of a candle by the tabernacle, and a man who had given every ounce of himself in service to Christ. Finally coming home. He died as he lived, in simplicity, in stillness, in surrender. The news broke just hours later, because Francis didn't just preach the gospel. He let it leak out of him, in his gestures, in his choices, in his refusals to condemn, in his endless invitations to begin again. He called the church to be a field hospital. Now, that hospital remains open, because he reminded us where to find the wounded. He called for a revolution of tenderness. Now, that revolution marches on, not in crowds, but in quiet hearts. And though some in power may try to move on, the poor will not forget. The sinners will not forget. The forgotten will remember the one who remembered them. Because the echo of mercy doesn't need permission to continue. It just needs people willing to listen. That's the truth about legacy. It's not a statue. It's the way people feel after you've gone. And everywhere, in voices low and strong, from basilicas to back alleys, the world is beginning to say the same thing. He made God believable again. Part 4. The cross after the candle. When grief becomes calling. There is a moment after a great light goes out when darkness doesn't fully arrive. Instead, there is a glow. Soft, sacred, heavy. That was what settled over the church after Pope Francis's death. Not despair, not panic, but something deeper. Grief touched by purpose. Hearts didn't just mourn him, they felt summoned by him. As if, in his departure, the Spirit whispered to every soul, "Now, you carry what he carried." Because Francis never intended to keep the light for himself. He was always passing it through tears, through smiles, through contradictions, through the honest pain of a man who knew God didn't need perfection, only surrender. And now the church stood at the foot of a new cross, the cross of responsibility, the cross of continuation, the cross of daring to love without his voice guiding from Rome. In the days following his funeral, something began to shift. Not in headlines, not in documents, but in hearts. Parishes started adding an extra moment of silence during Mass. Seminarians began rereading his homilies with trembling hands. Lay people started speaking not of what he did, but of who they wanted to become because of him. He had called the church to go out to the margins. Now, people were going, not because it was his directive, but because it had become their conviction. A priest in a village in Colombia began holding Mass in the middle of the town square. A bishop in Italy refused to sit on the cathedral throne, saying, "It doesn't feel right anymore." A nun in India began teaching catechism under a tree, barefoot, saying, "This is where Jesus would have sat." What is this if not the fire of the Spirit? Not one that roars, but one that smolders until it fills everything. Francis had once said, "The church doesn't grow by proselytism, she grows by attraction." Now the church was becoming attractive again, not through polish, but through compassion, through humility, through the tear that refuses to dry when a brother is hungry or a sister is rejected. This was the Pope's invisible inheritance, not a sharper theology, but a softer heart. And soft hearts are dangerous things, because they break, but they also burn. And the burning had begun. People began seeing the world differently, seeing Christ in the disabled child, the exhausted single mother, the addict, the outcast, the angry. Francis had given them new eyes, not eyes to judge, but to kneel. A woman in South Africa who had left the church decades ago whispered at his memorial, "He broke something in me, but it was the right thing to break." That is what holy grief does. It breaks what needed to be broken. And in the cracks, the Spirit breathes. This was no longer mourning. It was transformation. Not a church in shock, but a church in motion. Because the church now understood something that Francis lived and died to teach. The world will not be saved by perfect people. It will be saved by those who dare to love in the middle of their own brokenness. He once said, "You don't need to climb to find God. You need to fall, and let him catch you." Now people were falling into prayer, into service, into quiet revolutions of grace. And every time someone knelt beside the pain of another, every time someone forgave without conditions, every time someone chose mercy instead of fear, he was there, not in body, but in spirit, in echo, in fire. The candle had gone out, but the cross remained, and it was no longer just his, it was ours. A brief Vatican statement confirmed what millions soon would feel in their spirit before hearing it in the press. With profound sorrow, we announce that His Holiness Pope Francis passed peacefully this morning after a moment of private prayer in communion with the Lord. But somehow, the world already knew. Even before the official words were spoken, something had shifted. It was as though the soul of the church had sighed. Part 5. Heaven's silence and the church's question. What happens now? When the candle flickers out and the crowds have gone home, when the vestments are folded and the tomb is sealed, something quieter and far more dangerous begins to stir. The question. It is not shouted. It is not tweeted. It is not announced in synods or debated in cathedrals, but it breathes inside every heart that loved him. What happens now? What happens to a church that was learning to walk again and suddenly loses the one who taught it how to stand? What happens when the voice that reminded us we still belonged, no matter how lost, goes silent? What happens when the shepherd is gone? The answer does not come easily. For many, the instinct was to freeze, to wait, to sit in the ash of grief and let others decide what comes next. But God does not build from frozen places. He builds from surrendered ones. And that's where the church found itself in the wake of Pope Francis's death. Not powerless, but surrendered, stripped, laid bare before heaven with only the memory of mercy and the haunting presence of his empty chair. But that empty chair did not speak of power. It spoke of invitation. Because Francis had not pointed to himself, he had pointed forward, to the broken, to the lost, to Christ. And now that he was gone, it became clear the church could no longer lean on him. It had to become what he believed it could be. Not just an institution, but a witness. Not just a theology, but a home. Not just a tradition, but a testimony to grace alive in a fractured world. There were murmurs within the Vatican, whispers of succession, of direction, of control. But in the streets, in the chapels, in the margins, the real church had begun to move. In Argentina, a group of laypeople began visiting hospitals, not with doctrine, but with presence. In France, a parish council voted to turn half its budget toward migrant care, saying it's what he would have done. In Vietnam, a young seminarian stood in front of his classmates and said, "I'm no longer afraid to be a priest, because he showed me that even the smallest among us can reflect the face of God." This was not the clamor of reform. This was resurrection in whispers. Because what Francis left behind was not a system to maintain. It was a spirit to follow. And the spirit was speaking, not through titles, but through tears. Not through laws, but through love. Not through strategies, but through simplicity. It had always been this way. When Christ ascended, he left no blueprints. He left witnesses. When the early church lost its apostles, it did not collapse. It remembered. It prayed. It burned. And now the church, once again, stood on the edge of something holy. Not because of what it had, but because of what it had lost. Loss is sacred, because it makes room. Room for memory. Room for calling. Room for Christ. Pope Francis was never trying to lead a church into greatness. He was trying to lead her back to the heart of the gospel, to the table where Judas still has a seat, to the shore where Peter is still forgiven, to the road where Emmaus still burns with recognition. That journey does not die with a pope. It deepens. Now, the path must be walked, not just remembered. By bishops who will choose listening over lecturing. By priests who will carry confessionals into the streets. By families who will welcome the stranger like kin. By the lost who will dare to return because they once saw a man in white weep for them. Francis has left, but he has not abandoned. And the church, standing in the holy tension between memory and mission, must ask the question not with fear, but with fire. Lord, what do you want of us now? Because the silence of heaven after the death of a holy man is not emptiness. It is the pause before the Spirit moves. Part 6. The weight of an empty chair. Who dares to sit where mercy sat? The chair of Peter stood silent, not just physically empty, but spiritually radiant. Not a throne, not a symbol of command, but a hollow, carved out by the weight of mercy. For over a decade, Pope Francis had occupied that seat not as a ruler, but as a servant. He had redefined it, not by changing its title, but by changing its tone. Where others had spoken from it with certainty, he spoke with trembling compassion. Where others had defended its authority, he used it to defend the poor. Where others had guarded it from scandal, he let it weep in public, bruised but real. The faithful, and even the distant, felt a tug, a holy ache, as if heaven had moved something that earth couldn't quite explain. The Pope was gone. And yet, strangely, God felt nearer. There were no grand ceremonies that morning, no grandiose declarations. Instead, in cathedrals and village chapels, in convents and living rooms, in busy cities and forgotten places, people simply stopped. Stopped what they were doing. Stopped scrolling. Stopped talking. And listened. And now, that chair was vacant. And the world asked, in whispers that echoed through the marble halls of the Vatican, who will dare to sit there now? Not just who will be elected, not who is next in line, but who will have the courage to carry what he carried without crushing it? Because the church was not seeking a replacement. She was standing before a mystery of mercy, a mystery of proximity, a mystery of broken holiness. And the one who would fill that space had to be more than capable. He had to be wounded, because only those who limp walk like Christ. In conclave, the cardinals prayed, some with ambition, some with fear, some with the quiet ache of knowing that something had changed forever, and that to try to control it would be to grieve the Holy Spirit. A few whispered privately, no one can follow a man like Francis. But those who knew Francis knew the truth. He never wanted to be followed. He wanted Jesus to be followed. The next pope would not be a successor in the political sense. He would be a spiritual continuation, not of personality, but of posture. The posture of bending low, of choosing silence over spin, of letting his heart break every day for the suffering of the world. Because the seat left behind was not a platform, it was a cross. In countries around the world, faithful Catholics watched with a strange mixture of hope and hesitation. They didn't want a return to cold distance. They didn't want to trade the voice of the Good Shepherd for another manager. They wanted a father, a brother, a man whose holiness could not be contained by protocol. In Uganda, a young woman said in an interview, "I don't know who the next pope will be, but I hope he smells like Jesus, like the kind of man who has sat with the suffering." In Canada, a priest whispered during Eucharistic adoration, "Let it be someone who has been forgiven deeply, so he can forgive deeply." In the barrios of Buenos Aires, old friends of Francis lit candles and said nothing. They simply waited, because they knew, as he had always reminded them, the Spirit doesn't come with noise. He comes when hearts are still. And so the church stilled. The conclave proceeded. Smoke would rise. A name would be announced. But in the silence before that moment, the real question burned in the soul of the body of Christ. Will the one who comes next continue to wash feet or sit above them? Because this was not a moment for politics. It was a moment for prayer, for discernment, for trembling, for humility so deep it could only come from heaven. Francis had reintroduced the world to a God who kneels, a God who listens, a God who walks out into storms not to lecture, but to lift. Now, someone else must sit where he sat and do the same. And maybe that's the hardest thing about following a holy man. You don't inherit his title. You inherit his burden. And that burden is not fame. It's not legacy. It's the unshakable, unending, unrelenting fire to make Christ known to the broken, to the afraid, to the sinner who no longer believes he is wanted. That's what Francis carried. That's what the chair now holds. And that is what the next pope, whoever he is, will face the moment he sits down. Not applause, not comfort, but the living memory of a man who made the whole church fall silent because he spoke with the voice of love. Part 7. The one who comes next. Will he carry the flame or extinguish it? The white smoke rises. The world watches. A name is announced. The balcony door is open, and a man in white steps forward. He waves. He prays. He speaks. But in the silence between each word, the church listens for something deeper. Not just who he is, but what he carries. Because this moment is not about succession. It's about spirit. And what Pope Francis left behind cannot be inherited. It must be shouldered. He didn't pass down an empire. He passed a fire that comforts the broken and burns the indifferent. A fire that makes space for sinners, but consumes pride. A fire that is not of this world. And now the man who steps into Peter's shoes must ask himself, do I dare walk this path of mercy, even if it costs me everything? The world is watching, but heaven is waiting. Not to see power reasserted, not to see robes and rituals, but to see if the one who comes next will kneel, not before kings, not before cameras, but before Christ, present in the faces of the poor, the rejected, the lost. Because the throne Francis vacated is not made of marble. It is made of humility, because when a father dies, the house goes quiet. But when a holy man dies, the soul leans in. Francis had been a shepherd in the deepest sense of the word. He wasn't a ruler in white robes, perched above the people. He was a brother who walked beside them, a pastor who smelled like the sheep, a priest who never forgot what it meant to be forgiven. And now, he was no longer with us. Yet what lingered was not despair. What lingered was presence. He redefined the papacy not with reforms, but with risk. The risk of being misunderstood. The risk of being mocked. The risk of being merciful in a world that still confuses mercy with weakness. And now, his successor must choose. Will he protect what was, or press into what could be? In the days following the conclave, the new pope began his ministry. He did not speak with thunder, but those who listened closely could hear a tremble in his voice. Not of fear, but of reverence. He knew what he was stepping into. He knew this was not just a seat of leadership. It was a place of holy burden. He made no promises of grandeur. He did not speak of strategies. He spoke of wounds. And in that, the church began to breathe. Because wounds, not plans, are where God does his best work. At his first Mass, the new Pope quoted Francis, "A church that doesn't cry, doesn't feel, and a church that doesn't feel cannot heal." It wasn't performance. It was alignment. And slowly, hearts began to open. Not to the man alone, but to the continuation of the call. Because God doesn't start something like Francis, only to let it fade. He continues it, in flesh and blood, in different accents and expressions, but with the same heartbeat. Christ for the little ones, mercy for the forgotten, hope for the dying, love for those who believe themselves unlovable. This new pope was not the same man. He didn't try to be, but in his eyes, there was something familiar. The same softness that once made a hardened world believe again. In a favela in Brazil, someone watching the broadcast murmured, "I don't know who he is, but if he keeps the poor close, I'll listen." In an abandoned church in Poland, a small group gathered in silence and lit a candle under a photo of Francis. Underneath it, they placed a handwritten note. "Carry the flame, don't let it go out." That is the true test of succession, not continuity of power, but continuity of compassion. And while debates rage in institutions about direction and doctrine, a quieter revolution has already begun. In every soul inspired by Francis to love more freely, to forgive more quickly, to listen more deeply, to walk more humbly. This is the church he dreamed of, a church not made in his image, but remade in Christ's. And now, the man who wears the white must decide. Will he echo heaven or appease earth? Will he keep the fire alive or return to cold stone? Because the world doesn't need a replacement. It needs a witness. And the chair of Peter is not a position. It's a cross. Whoever dares to carry it must first be crucified in mercy, just like the one who came before. Part 8. When a flame becomes a movement, the mercy that refused to die. Something had shifted. Not because a new pope was named, not because a title changed hands, but because a seed had cracked open, and what Pope Francis planted was finally beginning to grow. Not in Vatican halls, but in alleyways, in classrooms, in living rooms, in the hidden places of the soul. The fire he carried, that fire of tenderness, of truth wrapped in compassion, did not vanish with his breath. It spread. This was not legacy in the usual sense. This was not nostalgia. It was a living movement, quietly swelling like yeast in dough, transforming the church from the inside out. It started with small things. Parishes began hosting confession, not just in booths, but in cafes. Bishops began washing the feet of prisoners, not just on Holy Thursday, but all year long. Seminarians began asking harder questions about holiness, not about clerical ambition, but about proximity to pain. Because Francis had taught them that holiness smells like humanity. He had shown them that God's glory is not above us in gold, but beside us in wounds. And the church began to remember. Not perfectly, not universally, but truthfully. It remembered what it was like to cry again, to blush again, to be poor in spirit again. And in those memories, mercy took root. It wasn't organized. It wasn't televised, but it was real. In the Philippines, a street boy who once begged outside a cathedral was baptized by a priest who saw him not as a problem, but as a prophecy. In Nigeria, a parish turned its entire Easter budget into scholarships for girls. In Chicago, a woman once abused by clergy returned to a small chapel and sat before the Blessed Sacrament for the first time in 20 years. Through tears, she whispered, "You believed me. You listened. And now I can listen to you again." In the Vatican, the corridors of power felt suspended. The chair of Peter sat empty, but it no longer looked like a throne. It looked like a cross. And that, perhaps, was Francis's greatest miracle. He had returned the church to its knees. Not through force, not through perfection, but through the humility of love. He had lived like Christ in a church often tempted to live like Caesar. He had touched the untouchable, sat with the forgotten, spoke in truth with tears in his eyes. And this was Francis still speaking, not with his mouth, but with the lives he reawakened. He had said once, "God's mercy is not an idea. It is a wound that never closes, so that love can keep pouring out." And now that wound had become the doorway for countless souls to come back home. People weren't just remembering him, they were imitating him, not in style, but in substance. Because true saints don't want fans, they want followers of Jesus. Francis never wanted a church that looked like him. He wanted a church that looked like Christ, the real Christ, the barefoot one, the weeping one, the one with dirt under his nails and blood in his beard and forgiveness on his lips. And now that image of Christ was being rediscovered by those who had been disillusioned, by those who had been burned, by those who had stopped asking if God saw them, because Francis had. He had been the bridge between despair and dignity, and though the bridge builder was gone, the bridge still stood. And it was being walked upon by the ashamed, by the exiled, by the proud, now humbled, by the righteous, now silenced, by all who had once thought they were outside the reach of grace. They now came forward, slowly, timidly, but with hope, because he had pointed them toward a Jesus they had never truly known. And this is what mercy does. It does not die with its messenger. It becomes mission in the hearts it heals. In Argentina, a group of teachers launched a project called El Camino del Papa Pobre, the way of the poor pope. Its only mission, to remind students that greatness is measured in how we lift others up. In Rome, a journalist who had once ridiculed Francis wrote an op-ed titled, "I was wrong. He believed in the gospel more than I ever believed in my own cynicism." And in a small village in Portugal, where no bishop had visited in years, a group of elderly women set up a simple altar under a tree, placed his photo next to the Eucharist, and prayed, "Help us keep the fire. We are small, but we remember." Yes, they remembered, and they would not forget. Because when a flame becomes a movement, it cannot be contained. Not by death, not by successors, not by fear. It is the Spirit. It is mercy in motion. It is the gospel alive, and it was never meant to stop. Part 9. The Church Awakes. A new beginning in the silence of loss. The Church, in the days following Pope Francis's death, found itself suspended. Not because of confusion or disbelief, but because, for the first time in many years, the Church paused. Not in grief alone, but in quiet reflection. The passing of this beloved father had opened the door to something we had forgotten to ask for. Something we had missed in our pursuit of structures, doctrines, and institutions. The renewal of our hearts. Francis's death was not just the closing of a chapter. It was the invitation to start again. In the very places that had once felt like graveyards of faith, new life began to emerge. In villages where faith had dwindled, in cities where people had long stopped believing, and in hearts that had suffered too much to hope again. Francis had always said that the church must go to the margins. Now, those margins weren't just places on a map. They were places in the soul. The new pope, whose name echoed through the corridors of the Vatican, began his ministry not with policies, but with prayer. His first actions were not ceremonial. They were a call to the broken, to the rejected, to the forgotten. And as he knelt in humble places, as he washed the feet of the weak and the ill, as he embraced the brokenhearted, he became a mirror of Francis, not an imitation, but a continuation, a resurrection. Francis had once said, "I want a church that is poor for the poor." And now the church was finding its way back to that poverty. Not just economic poverty, but spiritual poverty. The kind that receives instead of demanding. The kind that gives without fear. The kind that opens its doors and simply loves. In small towns in Italy, young people began opening their doors to refugees, offering a place to stay, a meal to share, and most importantly, a listening ear. In Spain, a parish decided to give its resources to help the homeless before anything else. No programs, no grand meetings, just love in action. This is what Francis had awakened. A church not defined by its grandeur, but by its willingness to serve. His leadership was not measured in declarations, but in how many hearts beat again with faith after hearing his voice. And now that voice was silent, but the echo would only grow. In Argentina, his homeland, mourners didn't gather in plazas with protest signs or shouts. They gathered with candles, with silence, with faces turned heavenward, whispering words of thanks, not just grief. In Rome, flowers began appearing at the gates of the Vatican, not in power, but in presence. In Brazil, a group of mothers who had been silently suffering from loss began praying in unison for the restoration of their hope. "We have learned," one said, "that love doesn't need to be seen to be felt." And Pope Francis taught us that God's love is so much bigger than anything we could ever imagine. And that was the legacy he left, not written on papers, but etched in hearts. The love that is not seen is the love that changes the world. The church began to see again, and this was the beginning of a new awakening. Francis had spent his life turning the church back to the heart of Christ, to the poor, to the broken, to the excluded. But now, it was the turn of the faithful to decide if they would stay where he had left them, in the margins, or rise and bring others with them. The awakening wasn't dramatic. It wasn't about big names or sweeping declarations. It was in the quiet moments, in the heart of the mother praying for her children, in the hands of the homeless man who offered bread to another, in the voice of a young person who finally felt like they mattered. This was the church rising from the ashes of loss, not stronger in numbers, but deeper in spirit. For what Francis had left was not a legacy of leadership. It was a legacy of love. A love that had no beginning and no end. A love that didn't look away. A love that stayed. And now, as the world watches and waits, the church awakens. Part 10. The church lives, carrying the light of mercy into the future. The story does not end with death. It never does. When Pope Francis passed, many thought it was the end of an era, but it was not. It was the beginning of something deeper, something more sacred. A rebirth. The church was not left empty. It was left full of potential, full of light that had been kindled by one man's willingness to live the gospel authentically. What Francis left was not an institution, but a movement. A movement that doesn't ask for applause, but for hearts willing to serve, to listen, to love in the face of suffering, and to humble themselves before the needs of the world. In the wake of his death, many had expected to hear grand words about the future of the church. But what the world heard instead were whispers of renewal. In the silence of his absence, people began to speak louder than ever before. Not with words of revolution, but with acts of mercy. Not with slogans, but with lives given away for others. The church, once again, was becoming what it was meant to be. Not an institution of power, but a community of witnesses. In small churches, priests began washing the feet of the poor on every Sunday. In hospitals, volunteers who had never stepped foot in a church before started organizing prayer groups for the sick, simply because they had seen the love of God through Francis's eyes. And in the streets, In the faces of the weary and the broken, the message of God's mercy began to burn brighter than ever. What Francis had done in his lifetime, his deep, quiet revolution of tenderness, was no longer just his. It was ours, and the world had begun to see that this wasn't a thing to be built, but a way to be lived. In that sense, Pope Francis's death had done more than mark the passing of a leader. It had marked the resurrection of the Church in mercy. It was a mercy that could no longer be hidden behind walls. It was a mercy that could no longer be confined to words. It was a mercy that walked barefoot into the streets, that was willing to sit with sinners, and that never stopped believing in the world's potential to love. Now, the Pope was gone. But the Pope's mission, that mission of radical love, of humility, of mercy, was not gone. It was alive in each of us. And as the Church looks ahead, it is no longer looking for a replacement. It is looking for a continuation of the mission of Christ, a continuation of mercy, because that is the message Pope Francis left us with. The Church must always be a place where the heart of Christ is found, not in comfort, not in power, but in the service of love. And so, as we walk forward, as we go on without him, we are walking with him in the spirit that he ignited. Francis is not dead. He has only gone ahead of us, showing us the way to live. And the Church is more alive than ever. Little handwritten notes, folded pages of scripture, children's drawings. One note simply said, "You taught me that God still remembers people like me." No signature, no date, just raw gratitude left on marble steps. In a tiny chapel in South Korea, an elderly nun fell to her knees and wept as she held a small photo of Francis, his hand gently touching the head of a child. She whispered, "Thank you, Father. You reminded us how to love." Pope Francis may no longer be with us, but his spirit, his message, and his call to mercy are far from gone. His death was not a defeat. It was a turning point. A divine invitation for us all to step forward and carry the torch of love, humility, and compassion that he ignited. What happens next is not for the Church alone to decide. It is a call for each of us, as believers, to live out his legacy, to walk in the footsteps of Christ, with mercy in our hearts, and to never forget that, as Pope Francis taught us, the last shall be first, and love is always stronger than fear. So now, as we stand at the threshold of this new chapter, we must ask ourselves, will we continue to live as he did, loving, forgiving, and serving? Or will we let the light he gave us fade? If this message has touched your heart, don't let it end here. Share this video with others who need to hear the message of mercy and hope. Subscribe to this channel for more content that inspires, uplifts, and challenges us to live out the teachings of Pope Francis. And in the comments, let us know, how has Pope Francis's life impacted you? How will you carry his mission forward? The mission doesn't end. It's just beginning. Thank you for being a part of it.